Hello, and welcome once more to A Glastonbury Romance. "Who are these children, Uncle?" inquired Louis of Mr. Twig. "Hadn't you better be taking that little boy home to his mother, child?" said Lily to Sis. "'Tis Granny," replied Sis. "Mother be dead and buried." Abel Twig was now scrutinizing with sly interest a paper bag carried by Lily. The girls were accustomed to bring home him some casual token of Mr. Weatherwax's activity, and it presented itself very strongly to his mind that here was a providential chance of getting rid of the children. So he spoke up. "They be good children, they be, my rosebuds. 'Twere the sight of such good children walking quietly along road, while their decent mothers cleaned house, that made Uncle Abel call 'em in. But now be time for ye all," he turned to Sis as being the one among the group who was most grown up, "to begin traipsin' home along." He gave Lily, who carried the paper bag, a little twitch of the sleeve and pulled her a few steps aside. "Have you bought some of thy sweet apples what old Weatherwax do keep so long in hayloft?" he whispered craftfully. "If he'd been brought they, I'll be terrible thirsty for 'em. Me stomach be waterin' to get me teeth into 'em. Them nice little firm sweet fruities. Poor old uncle have a gert fancy to taste, now and quick, what his pretty nieces have brought to he in thick little bag. What a creep, eh?" "Of course, Uncle Abel," said Lily sweetly. "You shall have them at once. There, I haven't had my kiss yet." And she touched his bristly cheeks with her lips. "Of course they are all for you. Eat them, keep them, cook them. They're yours entirely. Louis and I brought them for you with our love." She gladly enough handed the paper bag over to him, and smoothed out from her cream-colored, neatly gloved fingers the ruffled front of her black dress. Once in the possession of this great bag of Heptadeirian fruit, the astute owner of Backwater Hut felt himself to be master of the situation. He took out 5 beautiful apples, one by one, and began munching with hurried bites, though not without difficulty, for his teeth were few, the first of these. The other 4 were cunningly handed over to Captain Jackie. "These apples," he said, "what these young ladies have brought me, the cause why they funny men, what I tell ye of, call their town Avelinia, which be ancient British for orchard." Here the wily old man addressed himself to Lieutenant Nelly. "Ye be a robber band, ye be, same as they fierce invaders what plundered poor old King Avalok. These apples be rich plunder. Robber bands do march. Robber bands do, slow and quiet, carrying their plunder, though they be round thick corner of road. Then they do eat what they've been taken from frightened natives." He had said quite enough. Without a second's hesitation, in the most resolute order and profound silence, the 4 children went off hand in hand along the footpath by the roadside in the direction of home. Louis and Lily, now safely inside the railings, watched with wonder the surprising exhibition of discipline in this well-executed retreat. When the 4 were near the twist of the road which would take them out of sight, they saw Jackie turn and give one hurried glance around. He then began running. He was followed by Nellie first, then by Sis, who carried Bert like a bundle of something precious and heavy, hugged against her body. As if ashamed in their prolonged observation of this ragamuffin crew, Louis and Lily now devoted themselves to being as ladylike and patronizing as they could be to their eccentric uncle. They were, however, so attached to the old man that it was not long before they were unburdening their bosoms of 1,000 intimate troubles, triumphs, and grievances. It appeared they were due in an hour's time to take tea with Emma, the confidential servant of Tilly Crow, and much they had to relate had to do with the Philip Crow establishment. Uncle Abel, on his part, had a good deal to say about the recent experiences of his ancient crony and ally, Old Jones, in his ward to the hospital. To anything concerning the hospital, both the girls lent a curious ear, Louis being especially interested in the culinary economies, which were notoriously generous in that institution, while Lily kept inquiring about the bed covers, the linen chests, the nurses' caps, the doctors' white coats, the slippery floors, and whatever it was, from Miss Bibby Fell's daffodil beds, or Mrs. Crow's conservatory, or Mayor Wallof's greenhouses that the best gifts of flowers were received. Brandy. Emma says that poor Mrs. Crow is very concerned about all this flying, observed Louis. Yes, threw in Lily, who, being the younger, was more romantic than the bosom cook, and if possible more ladylike. Yes, Emma says that the mistress cries her poor self to sleep night after night, thinking of all the money they're spending. But they be rich, bain't they? Commented number one, thinking to himself, I be a wonderful comfortable man, I be. I bain't one for envying, they rich. And full of complacency, the old man surveyed the tops of the budding willow trees, the brown and white back of the cow Betsy, and these two gracious visitors seated side by side on his kitchen chairs. Emma says, went on Louis, whose character it was to give the practical details of life their due proportion, leaving to the more pensive and more romantic Lily the psychological aura of the events under discussion, that Mr. Crow made it certain he was going to have all Cannons Crow's money, and that he had been spending more than he could afford on Wookey Hole alone. He likes electrifying things, murmured Lily dreamily. They tell about Wookey Hole Witch up in the Wells. Do you remember, Louis, what the woman said when we were out there on Choir Treat Day? How she'd once been down there, where the stalagmites and stalactites grow, and that she ran out in hysterics thinking she saw the witch? It's the flying he's turned on now, went on Louis, holding the topic resolutely bent down to facts. That's the main trouble. Of course, on the top of his well-known electric schemes, it does mean a very considerable expenditure. As she uttered this judicial remark, Louis crossed her knees, as if her neat shoes were resting upon an embroidered footstool instead of upon number one's brick floor, and folding her gloved hands over her knees, she began rubbing her right hand very slowly over her left hand. It must have been with this precise gesture, with these exact words, and with the identical intonation combined with frowning, glancing, given to some remote object, in the present case, alas, to nothing more dignified than number one's swill pail, turned upside down, that Miss Ephemia Drew had received the town gossip about Philip Crow's financial state. Who is that wild-looking child you have here just now, Uncle? Inquired Louis, dropping her Miss Drew airs. Eh, who? What should do you mean? Muttered the old man with startled embarrassment. He had been secretly hoping that no more would be said about his previous visitors. The thin little girl with great black eyes, and her hair all uncombed, and her clothes so dirty. As far as I know, that be Nellie, replied Abel Twig. But Nellie what, Uncle? Insisted Louis. She must have a surname. I talked to my friend Jones in hospital about Nellie, confessed the old man reluctantly. I told him all about she, and how she went around with Jackie Jones and Sis Cole, and he did say that her mother's name was Morgan. So I suppose, though mind ye I bain't sure, that her name be similar-wise. He was silent and then muttered under his breath, Morgan Nellie, Morgan Eleanor, Morgan, as if he were wondering how to give to these syllables some special rhythmic secret. At the name Morgan, he was surprised to notice the two sisters exchanging a swift, significant glance. Louis actually nodding at Lily, as who should say, You see, that's just what would happen with that child of all children should be picked up by Uncle. Full of greater fear than ever, after he had caught this interchange of glances, then by continuing the topic he bring more harm in some way about his little friend, number one hardly went on. I expect Nellie's name isn't Morgan at all. No, what I came to think of it, my friend Jones, was sure it wasn't. Jackie called she Nellie. Sis called she Nellie. There be many well-thought-on women in the world that have only one name. Number one racked his brain to think of some of these famous monosyllabic females. At last his face lit up. He recalled his granddad's lake village. The Lady of the Lake, he said triumphantly. He stopped in dismay. For there came into his head a conversation with old Mr. Merry, the curator of the Glastonbury Museum, from whom he had sought to get information about his grandfather's historic field. This authority had told him that the real Lady of the Lake was none other than Morgan le Fay, the very ambiguous sister of King Arthur. It's Nellie Morgan that was here with Jackie Jones and Sis Cole, said Louis with decision. You let your kind heart run away with you, Uncle. It's lucky no one but Lily and me knows about this. But we're told you now, and you do know, so you act accordingly. Want to be talking about me, pretty? What be talking about me, pretty? Stammered Uncle Abel. Lily, meanwhile, had assumed a sad, poetic expression. What he feels, 'tis strange to think, she interrupted dreamily, as he lies pondering on a poor betrayed girl, and on a little child who belongs to him, and yet doesn't belong to him. Stuff and nonsense, cried Louis. All he thinks about is electricity and flying machines and asking Mayor Wallop to drop in to dinner. He doesn't think of anyone's feelings. Will it be best to tell Emma about the child being with Jackie and Sis, and about her having been at Uncle's house? Lily put into the question as much dramatic gravity as she were taking a personal part in some great cause célèbre. Louis knitted her brows in solemn consideration. It will be wise, as she replied, at the very manner in Euphemia drew, to leave what we say till we see how things arrange themselves. I would not like to upset Emma, and it might make it harder for Emma, too, if she knew what Mrs. Crowe didn't know. Number 1 could stand all this no longer. His awe and his nieces broke down completely under the pressure of his mental bewilderment. He arose up from his chair. What the holy Terry, he cried, are you gals gabbling about? That's what I'd like to know, too. Lily's expression was a masterpiece of refined protest, sentimental relish for the whole situation, and an irresistible desire to be the only one permitted to tell him all. But she was not that one, for that one was Louis. Don't get agitated, you poor darling, and do please sit down. It's all very dreadful. The intonation of Miss Drew was mingled here with a vague mimicry of certain lady visitors. But we must be as collected and sensible as we can. The truth is that Emma has found out a very unhappy story. It appears... Here Louis took breath and fidgeted in a modest manner with her ribbon, that Mr. Crowe misconducted himself some 8 years ago with Jenny Morgan. Jenny seems to have forgotten herself completely, and the result was that she had a baby. The style in which Louis delivered herself of this grand climax was, and needless to point out, entirely her own. No one but Louis would have used that derogatory and indeed disagreeable word, misconducted. No one but Louis would have used that expression, forgot herself, for the normal lapse from the virginal state. Jenny has taken a drink, Louis went on, since then, but she works for the child. She couldn't bring herself to dispose of the child. She used to hear such terrible things of those institutions. Emma thinks she sends her little money every second Wednesday. Emma knows she always goes to the post office on that day. That's what Emma thinks, mind you, that he sends her a little regularly. Emma doesn't know for certain whether he does or not, but she is almost sure he does. Number 1's countenance had begun to beam with a relief and satisfaction. He had feared he knew not what, and now to learn that all this agitation was only about Nellie's illegitimacy completely reassured him. Nellie Morgan, he repeated cheerfully, and then, thinking of the curator's word, Morganelli, he added. Mr. Crowe isn't altogether a wicked man, threw in Lily. He is a strange man, though. I believe he lives a wild life unknown to the world. Her voice sank and ceased. She looked away into the distance, far away beyond the pollarded willows. A skillful observer might have read in her face that she felt that shame and even desertion would not have been without their own melancholy comprehensions if it had been her lot, in place of Jenny Morgan, to forget herself with so Byronic a seducer as Philip Crowe. Number 1, who had quite recovered his spirits since he had learned that his elegant nieces had nothing against Jackie's lieutenant except her birth, suggested now that before they left Beckware Hut they should see his garden. In pursuance of this design, he led the way through his back door, past the post to which Betsy was tethered, till he reached the little square plot surrounded by a low, whitewashed fence. Here were several rows of young peas and scarlet runners, and one row of freshly sprouted celery. But on the corner of the garden, a reserved space of about a square yard, waved in the warm air a fragrant patch of pheasant-eyed narcissus. Number 1 clicked open a little toy gate into his garden, and stepping carefully over the young vegetables, picked with reckless impetuosity at least half of these lotus-scented flowers. These he divided into 2 bouquets, of exactly the same size, And when, after a few affectionate goodbyes, for Louie and Lily felt very productive to their only male relation, the girls went off up Godney Road to where it joined Wells Road. These white flowers, pinned on their black dresses and matching most felicitously their black and white Easter hats, gave them a really charming appearance. Well, that's Glastonbury Romance for today. Some nice, dull stuff in there for you. Until next time, I'll see you in Glastonbury. Cheers.